Good day, and welcome to another episode of Cult Life with me, your host, Robin Jackson. Hello once again, and thanks for joining me this week. Really appreciate it. Welcome to another episode of Cult Life. This week we have a interesting show with regard to a cult that was quite a bit in the news here in South Africa in around about 2009, 2010. And the subsequent years after that. And towards the end of 2009, I was approached by a group of concerned parents which rallied against a cult which lured young adults with the promise of salvation and then encouraged them to abandon their studies and jobs, shun their families, and leave their homes to live with the cult leaders. Now, this cult operates as the Grace Gospel Church, which is an affiliate member of Team Ministries International, CTMI for short. And this Team Ministries International is based in Mauritius. Now, the methods that the church adopts and the promises it makes are typical of cult behavior. They prey on young people. They who are already committed Christians, and convince them to leave their church and join CTMI, which is a classic tactic of cults. They emphasize the need to embrace the church as their new family and to reject their biological families. And then the next move is to subtly manipulate the converts to marry somebody selected for them by the elders within the church. Some minors are sent to other churches where they are kept in seclusion so that their families or the authorities can't find them. Now, the group's leaders have even fought court battles to keep these children away from their parents or their guardians, which is quite scary. CTMI, Team Ministries International, was actually started by Mickey Hardy and his wife Audrey in 1980, way back in 1980. And after completing their Bible studies here in South Africa, the couple returned to Mauritius and started the church. And the church has actually subsequently branched into India, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, the UK, and of course here in South Africa. It's well known in Mauritius for its derogatory statements about other religious groups. Riots broke out way back in 1989 when the church was targeted by Mauritian Muslims after it made inflammatory statements about Islam and about Muslims. Former members of the cult also said that the cult leaders have set their sights on a town just outside of Durban, Pietermaritzburg, where they have also started to recruit members. Now, what the tactic was way back in 2009 is where they would attend sports days at a very popular and well-known girls' school, St. Mary's, in the Kloof area here in Durban. In the hope of recruiting new members. The group of concerned parents was formed when the churches in the upper highway area actually raised the alarm and concerns about the teachings and the practices of this group. They have ascertained that the cult's main agenda is to recruit young people from other churches. The cult preaches that Hardy should be the accepted apostle. The cult's leaders changed the original meaning of the Bible so that it justifies their actions. Now, this is, of course, seen all over the place within cults. Scripture is twisted to suit their doctrine. And very interestingly, I was called up by the concerned parents group, and they stumbled across my website and contacted me just to sit in one of the meetings. And I got to one of the meetings at one of the former members' houses. Myself and another outside member, Sean Semple, we got to this meeting, and the ex-members that were sitting around the table started relating their experiences. And I must admit, it sounded eerily very similar to an ex-JW meetup. If they didn't mention the name of the group or the church, you would have thought that the experiences related there were members of the ex-JW community. So it just shows you how the operating, the tactics that we use are very, very similar. The strategy involves criticism, of course, of all other churches, ministries and their ministers, stating that the other churches are teaching a false gospel. They hold leadership meetings designed to encourage pastors to cut any previous associations and to affiliate their churches to CTMI, Team Ministries International. Now in Durban, the Grace Gospel Church is led by, I don't know if it's still led by Basil O'Connell Jones, who has openly defended his church's teachings. And one of the newspapers told of that some of the people were sent to help build Hardy's church in Mauritius, where young girls are often married to older men in the cult. And these stories I've heard firsthand from parents from the concerned parents group. It is also believed that the elders choose partners for the followers, of course, and encourages them to marry within the cult. Doesn't that sound familiar? Now, Sean Semple, who's a therapist in the area, he met with some of the members of the cult and interviewed, did some interviews with them. And he also found that, it was very concerning that was happened with the Grace Gospel Church and Church Team Ministries International. He found that they displayed a loss of independence, critical reasoning, and robotic emotional responses, and of course were heavily dependent on the church jargon during conversations. Now we know that this is a classic tactic, or a classic identifying mark of cults is their loaded language or their jargon specific to the group is always used. And what this therapist did, he circulated a letter to the local churches and schools in which he shared his concerns that at best CTMI could be described as a sectarian group and at worst a cult. There is justification in using the term cult, as the young people he has worked with exhibit symptoms of extreme and unhealthy indoctrination. And this is what he said in a letter to the community. Now, at the time, O'Connell Jones refused to speak to the media, saying that the reporters should attend their church if anybody wanted to do proper research on their teachings. And he said, and I quote, "I do not want to be involved in this. I have no comment," he said. One of the former members of the group, Howard Silk, which I met at the time, he related his experience within the group. For 17 years, Howard Silk, who was a financial advisor from Hillcrest, thought his church was a normal religious group that encouraged people to follow the teachings of the Bible. Little did he know that this Grace Gospel Church was an affiliate member of Team Ministries International, which is, of course, this organization that has become notorious as a cult group and has very often been associated with fraud and with luring young people from their families and encouraging them to marry within the cult. So Howard still stumbled across the Grace Gospel Church, he says, in 1992 when his former friend Basil O'Connell Jones introduced him to the leaders of the church. O'Connell Jones described this wonderful church to Silk and encouraged him to visit its headquarters in Mauritius. And he said he left 3 toddlers with his in-laws and flew to Mauritius, attended the prayer sessions, and was just enthralled by the church's teachings, he says. Howard and his wife stayed at the home of the church members and listened to the church's teachings. And he says the teachings were very interesting. They took Christianity to another level, according to his words. At the time, the teachings made sense to him. And in 1993, Howard took his family and settled in Mauritius. He actually moved to Mauritius. And he says, and I quote, "I found it strange that we had to lie to immigration officials when we arrived. The church told us that we wouldn't tell the officials that we were involved in the church, or that we couldn't tell the officials that we were involved in the church. They said that the church was under persecution in Mauritius and we would not be allowed in." So that should have been the first alarm bells for Howard. And he did. He said that was actually strange. So he attended the conferences that were held regularly and listened, intently to the teachings. However, he soon started questioning the teachings of the church. And he says when he started asking questions about certain teachings, he was sidelined and called names. Members told him that he had a bad attitude, and he was ostracized from the group. He said that the cult members were forbidden to question elders about teachings, typical again of cult tactics or the identifying marks. Members were taught that the group is unique and superior to other churches. And he says it was scary because they almost became like robots, following the leaders without even thinking about what they were doing. Howard Silk left the church in 2008 after he had heard that young adults were being instructed to abandon their families and join the cult. He said he received a call from a member of a large church in the area, in the Hillcrest area here outside Durban, to let them know that their pastor had warned his congregation about the Grace Gospel Church, as it was cultic in nature, and was it worst actually a cult. But Howard says the leaders were very convincing. The kids leave their studies, their family, and their friends and join the cult. It's like they are, being brainwashed, of course. He says O'Connell Jones is a very charming, powerful personality, can easily convince people to join the cult. Another former member, Keith Brown, who I also met at the Concerned Parents group, he related his experience to me and to the media at the time. And he had a son. Keith Brown actually lost his son to this group. His son Stuart was 27 when he joined the church in 2006. And shortly after that, he was diagnosed with cancer. It was around this time that he started attending the church with some old friends. And Keith said he initially rejoiced, that Stuart was joining and getting involved in his spirituality. Stuart then married his English sweetheart, Louise, in a beautiful wedding ceremony here in Durban. And despite Keith Brown's reservations about his son's involvement in the church, he supported his son's decision to be rebaptized into the Grace Gospel Church, or Team Ministries International. Keith Brown's other son, Jeff, and his wife, Terry, also joined the Grace Gospel Church. And in 2007, Stuart and Louise attended a CTMI conference in Mauritius where they decided that they would settle and work for the church in Mauritius. And Keith said, we wondered about the treatment for Stuart. We were simply informed that this was God's will for them. They wanted to give their lives for God, he says. Stuart kept in contact with his father and his family while he was in Mauritius, but he did not elaborate on the work he was doing there. Keith says all he knew was that Stu was working for an ad agency, doing copywriting and helping Mickey Hardy with articles and a book. Keith said in 2008, Stuart had a massive seizure and was diagnosed with a brain tumor. He decided to immediately return to South Africa for treatment, and of course Keith was happy about this because he could be, under the care of his father and his family. Then Stuart and his wife then decided to house sit for a CTMI family, and they became aware that the family had returned and that Stuart was staying on without a word. And later on, he says he cannot describe the deep sense of loss, rejection, and confusion he felt as a father. Stuart later died in a hospice. The church leaders felt uncomfortable visiting Stuart in Keith Brown's home, which is why he was cared for in their homes, he said. At Stuart's funeral, Basil O'Connell Jones allegedly spent an hour defending his cult and condemning Christians. Now, this is the very same thing that Jehovah's Witnesses do at funerals. Funerals are a recruiting technique or a recruiting they recruit from the platform at funerals, and a little is said about and celebrated about the person that has died. Keith says there's a sense in which he does, I quote, he says, there's a sense in which I do not hold my sons and their wives responsible for this. Rather, the leadership have to answer for their powerful influence, which requires the children of parents who ask questions to distance themselves, believing that they are doing the will of God, said Keith Brown. Grace Gospel Church and Church Team Ministries International is still operating today. And I recently found out that a very well-known former international tennis player, Mary Pierce, has become very much involved in the Church Team Ministries International. And there are pictures doing the rounds of the leaders of Church Team Ministries International taking pictures with Mary at sporting and tennis events such as Wimbledon and so forth. So it's still operating, Church Team Ministries International. They had a lot of press coverage way back then. And the Concerned Parents group is still going, as they are still concerned with some of the children that were left behind and some of the members that are still in the group and how they are being treated and how the leaders defend this group in the media. And there's a big persecution complex, of course, because the leaders show that this is, of course, that what the Bible foretold, that the persecution they're getting in the media and from authorities is all part of being a Christian and a member of Church Team Ministries International. So this cult, as I said, I had some dealings with the Concerned Parents at the time. I did a lot of research, and it was just so uncanny and so, eerie when I sat there listening to the parents and the ex-members relating their experiences and how similar the stories were to former Jehovah's Witnesses. And I guess it's probably the same for many former cult members who relate their stories. So that's the show for today. The 18th episode, we're coming up for episode 20, which I want to actually celebrate. So the 20th episode, I want to make a special one. But to all the listeners around the globe, thank you for listening. And thank you for tuning in every week and for downloading wherever you are. Please, if you're on Apple iTunes, go and like and subscribe on YouTube as well. And leave a comment. I'd be glad to interact with you wherever you are. I really appreciate it. So until next week, bye for now.